Think. Pause everything for a moment and think carefully. Imagine that the most influential spiritual teacher in human history was not only speaking to crowds, but simultaneously transmitting a deeper current of knowledge beneath his words. Imagine that some of his teachings were not designed to be written, institutionalized, or repeated mechanically, but instead encoded, protected, and entrusted only to those capable of inner perception. Imagine that language itself was used as a veil, and that within certain words lived doors rather than meanings. What you are about to hear unfolds gradually, layer by layer, and the final revelation will be the most powerful of all, because it points directly to the source from which consciousness itself arises. Across ancient civilizations, from Egypt to Greece, from early Judaic mysticism to later philosophical schools, there is a recurring idea that reality originates from a single, indivisible principle. Philosophers later called this principle the monad, the one without division, the absolute unity from which all multiplicity flows. This was not merely an abstract idea, it was understood as living reality, the foundation of being itself. What is rarely explored openly is that Jesus taught from within this worldview, not as theory, but as lived realization. Pense. Imagine Jesus not only as a preacher of ethics, but as a master of inner knowledge. When he spoke of the Father, of unity, of being one, he was not speaking metaphorically alone. According to many scholars of early Christianity, including Elaine Pagels, the earliest followers of Jesus preserved traditions that emphasized direct inner knowing rather than external belief. These teachings did not survive intact within institutional religion, but fragments remained embedded in sayings, parables, and symbolic language. In ancient traditions, a name was never a casual label. A name represented essence, vibration, and alignment. To speak a true name was to touch the nature of what was named. This understanding existed deeply within Hebrew mystical traditions and later resonated with early Christian mysticism. Scholar Gershom Scholem demonstrated how sacred names were believed to contain creative power, not because of superstition, but because language was seen as a bridge between the invisible and the manifest. Now consider this carefully. Jesus did not emphasize belief as later theology would. He emphasized knowing. He spoke of truth as something that liberates through recognition. In the original linguistic context, knowing implied union, not information. This is why he said the kingdom was not coming from outside observation, but was already within. This statement aligns perfectly with the concept of the monad, because the monad is not distant. It is the unified source expressing itself through every level of existence, including you. Ask yourself why so many of Jesus' statements appear paradoxical. Why speak in riddles? Why conceal meaning within stories? Because according to ancient wisdom, truth that is given prematurely becomes distorted. Early mystical traditions taught that certain teachings were dangerous to the unprepared mind, not because they were evil, but because they dissolved illusions that people were still dependent on. This is why Jesus often said that only those with ears to hear would understand. Within this hidden stream of teaching, early mystics believed that Jesus transmitted 3 sacred designations of the One. These were not common names. They were not meant for public chanting or ritual display. They were principles expressed through sound, each pointing to a different aspect of the indivisible source. To speak them without understanding was considered meaningless. To speak them with alignment was considered transformative. At this point, if this message resonates with you, take a moment to support this work. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, share this video with those who feel called to deeper understanding, and write in the comments what you feel when you reflect on hidden knowledge. What will be shared throughout this journey is not meant to impress, but to awaken, and what will be revealed later may fundamentally change how you perceive life, identity, and the universe itself. Reflect on this deeply. What if prayer was never about asking an external power to intervene, but about remembering your origin? What if sacred words were not commands, but keys that aligned consciousness with truth? Early followers close to Jesus believed that when a sacred designation of the One was spoken in stillness, with intention and inner silence, it dissolved fear, separation, and the illusion of isolation. Silence always preceded revelation. Stillness always came before the word. This pattern appears repeatedly in ancient texts. Creation itself begins not with noise, but with ordered expression emerging from unity. Jesus mirrored this structure in his teachings. He did not rush revelation, he waited for readiness. As this exploration continues, we will approach the first of these sacred names, not as a sound to be repeated, but as a reality to be recognized. Before that moment arrives, reflect honestly on your intention. Are you seeking power, or are you seeking truth? Because these teachings respond only to sincerity. The gate does not open through force, curiosity alone, or repetition. It opens through recognition. This is only the threshold. Much remains concealed, and what comes next will challenge assumptions you may not even realize you carry. Think again. Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient transmission, where knowledge was not accumulated, but remembered, where truth was not argued, but recognized. In this deeper current of teaching, the first sacred designation of the monad was never presented as a secret word, but as a state of awareness. Early mystics understood that before any sound could carry power, the inner condition of the speaker had to be transformed. Without this inner alignment, even the most sacred language remained empty. In the spiritual environment of the first century, names were not arbitrary. They were expressions of essence. To speak a name was to participate in the nature of what was named. This is why Jesus consistently redirected attention inward. When asked about authority, about signs, about the coming of the kingdom, he refused external confirmation and returned again and again to inner perception. This pattern strongly aligns with teachings found in Hellenistic Jewish philosophy, particularly in the works of Philo of Alexandria, who described the divine source as an intelligible unity that could only be approached through inner purification and contemplative awareness. The first designation of the monad taught by Jesus was not meant to be spoken aloud casually. It was associated with recognition of unity. Early followers believed that this designation aligned the individual with the truth that separation is an illusion. When Jesus said that he and the Father were one, he was not making a claim of exclusivity. He was modeling realization. He was revealing what becomes visible when the mind releases division. This is why he later prayed that others would also be one, not symbolically, but experientially. Pause here and reflect. How often do you experience yourself as fragmented, divided between past and future, fear and desire, identity and expectation? The first designation of the monad was intended to dissolve this fragmentation. It was not a name you spoke to something above you, but a recognition you allowed within you. According to early mystical interpretation, when this recognition stabilized, fear lost its foundation, because fear requires separation to exist. This is also why Jesus repeatedly withdrew into solitude. Silence was not avoidance. Silence was preparation. Ancient traditions taught that the mind must become unified before it can approach unity. Noise, distraction, and compulsive thought scatter consciousness. Stillness gathers it. Only a gathered mind can perceive the one. Ask yourself this honestly. When you pray, do you speak more than you listen? When you seek answers, do you leave space for recognition? The early mystics believed that the first designation of the monad emerged naturally in silence, not through effort, but through surrender of inner conflict. This is why it was said that the pure in heart would see God, not because of moral superiority, but because inner purity was understood as inner unity. At this stage, reflect and engage. Write in the comments whether you believe unity is something to be achieved or something to be remembered. Share this video with someone who senses that truth is deeper than doctrine. Subscribe to the channel if you feel called to continue this journey. What follows will not simplify reality. It will deepen it. As we move forward, understand this clearly. The first designation was about being. The second moves toward knowing. Early traditions taught that once unity was recognized, knowledge transformed. Knowing was no longer accumulation of information, but direct insight. This is why Jesus spoke with authority, without citation. His words flowed from recognition, not repetition. There is a reason these teachings were not systematized. Systems become rigid. Living truth remains fluid. Jesus did not build a philosophy. He transmitted a way of seeing. The second designation of the monad addresses this shift in perception, and it challenges one of the deepest assumptions of the human mind, that truth is something external to be acquired. Before we approach that threshold, take a moment to feel where you are right now, not intellectually but inwardly. Do you sense resistance, curiosity, fear, stillness? These responses are not obstacles, they are indicators. The teachings respond to awareness, not perfection. What comes next will explore how knowing itself transforms when the illusion of separation dissolves. This is not yet the final revelation. That remains ahead, but the ground is being prepared carefully, as it always was. Now, imagine that unity has already been recognized, even if only briefly. Imagine that the inner division quiets, and for a moment there is no observer and no observed, only presence. According to early mystical understanding, this is where the second designation of the monad becomes perceptible, not as a word imposed from outside, but as a mode of knowing that arises when separation dissolves. Jesus consistently pointed toward this transformation of knowing, a knowing that does not depend on authority, tradition, or memory, but on direct insight. In the ancient world, knowledge was divided into two paths. One was accumulation, learning facts, laws, and doctrines. The other was revelation, knowledge that unveils itself when the inner condition is prepared. Jesus spoke almost exclusively from the second path. When he taught, people sensed authority not because of references, but because his words carried coherence. This aligns with what later thinkers described as noetic knowledge, a direct apprehension of truth. Philosophers influenced by Platonic thought understood that when the mind aligns with the One, knowledge ceases to be fragmented. The second designation of the monad was associated with this inner illumination. Early followers believed it awakened discernment, the ability to see reality without distortion. This is why Jesus spoke so often about blindness and sight. He was not referring to physical vision. He was describing the condition of consciousness. To see meant to perceive reality as unified. To be blind meant to interpret reality through division, fear, and projection. Consider how often perception is shaped by expectation. The mind filters experience through memory, identity, and belief. Early mystical teachings claim that this filtering creates illusion. Jesus challenged this directly when he spoke about becoming like a child. He was not romanticizing innocence. He was pointing to unconditioned perception, awareness not yet fractured by rigid interpretation. The second designation of the monad was said to restore this clarity, not by erasing experience but by integrating it. Scholars studying early Christian mysticism often note parallels with wisdom traditions beyond Christianity. The idea that true knowledge arises from inner stillness appears in multiple ancient paths. What makes Jesus unique is how directly he spoke from this realization, without abstraction. He used simple language to point toward profound inner shifts. This simplicity was intentional. Truth revealed plainly becomes visible only to those ready to see it. Reflect carefully on this. How much of what you believe do you actually see for yourself? How much is inherited, repeated, or assumed? The second designation of the monad confronts this question. It does not attack belief, it exposes its limitations. Early mystics taught that when this designation was contemplated in silence, perception reorganized itself, fear-based interpretations loosened, compulsive judgments softened. Reality appeared less hostile and more intelligible. Jesus often said that those who had would be given more, and those who did not would lose even what they thought they had. This was not moral condemnation. It described a law of awareness. When perception opens, understanding deepens naturally. When perception remains closed, even accumulated knowledge becomes hollow. The second designation was believed to open perception by dissolving inner resistance. Pause and feel this moment. Notice the quality of your attention right now. Is it tense, searching, relaxed, receptive? These qualities shape what can be known. The early followers understood that truth does not force itself. It reveals itself to readiness. This is why Jesus never chased followers. He invited them. Invitation respects freedom. Compulsion destroys insight. Engage here. In the comments, reflect on whether you believe truth is something to be defended or something to be discovered. Share this message if it resonates with your own experience of seeking. Subscribe to remain part of this unfolding exploration. What lies ahead goes deeper than understanding. It approaches the source from which understanding itself emerges. As we continue, understand this distinction clearly. The first designation was about being. The second was about seeing and knowing. The The third, which remains ahead, moves beyond both. Early traditions described it as the return to origin, the point where being and knowing collapse into pure presence. This final movement was considered the most powerful, not because it grants authority, but because it dissolves the illusion of separation completely. Jesus hinted at this state when he spoke of abiding, of remaining, of rest. He spoke of a peace not dependent on circumstance. These were not promises for the future. They were descriptions of a present reality, accessible through alignment. The third designation of the monad addresses this directly, but it was always approached last, never first. Without preparation, it could not be recognized. We are not there yet. The ground is still forming, but the direction is clear. What follows will challenge not only beliefs, but the very sense of identity that believes it holds them. Now, move beyond imagining. Rest in the idea that being and knowing have already converged. Early mystical traditions taught that when unity is recognized and perception is purified, there remains one final movement: return. Not return to a place, not return to a doctrine, but return to origin. This is where the third designation of the monad emerges, and it was regarded as the most guarded, not because it was dangerous, but because it was easily misunderstood. The third designation was never meant to be grasped by the mind. It could not be analyzed, repeated, or explained in conventional language. Jesus hinted at it when he spoke of abiding, of remaining in what is, of a peace that surpasses understanding. This was not emotional calm. It was ontological rest, rest in being itself. Early followers believed that when this designation was approached correctly, it did not produce visions, powers, or authority. It produced disappearance. The sense of a separate self softened, sometimes completely, revealing presence without division. Ancient sources describe this stage as the silence behind silence. Before words arise, before thought takes form, before identity claims ownership, there is pure awareness. The third designation of the monad was associated with this state. It was not spoken to activate something new. It was recognized as what had always been present. This is why Jesus said that before Abraham was, I am. He was not making a historical claim. He was pointing to timeless presence, awareness that precedes narrative and survives every form. This is also why fear dissolves at this level. Fear requires a future. It requires projection. In pure presence, there is no future to threaten and no past to defend. Early mystics describe this as freedom not from the world, but within it. Life continued. Responsibilities remained, but the inner posture changed. Action flowed from clarity rather than compulsion. Love ceased to be effort and became expression. Consider how radical this teaching truly was. It undermined every system built on control, fear, and dependency. If the divine is not distant, if unity is already present, if knowing is direct, and if origin can be recognized now, then no intermediary holds ultimate authority. This is one reason these teachings were veiled. Institutions require hierarchy. Awakening dissolves it. Jesus expressed this not through rebellion, but through embodiment. He healed not to display power, but to reveal alignment. He forgave not to demonstrate virtue, but to show freedom from psychological time. He faced death not as defeat, but as passage, demonstrating that identity rooted in the monad is not confined to form. This final designation of the One illuminated all of these actions from within. Reflect deeply here. How much of your identity is built on memory, expectation, and fear? Who would you be without the story you repeat about yourself? The third designation of the monad does not answer this question intellectually. It dissolves the question itself. In that dissolution, many early mystics reported an overwhelming sense of reverence, not toward an external God, but toward existence itself. This is why gratitude appears naturally at this stage. Not gratitude for circumstances, but gratitude for being. Existence is no longer taken for granted. Each moment feels complete, not because it is perfect, but because it is whole. Jesus referred to this when he spoke of fullness, of life abundant. He was not promising accumulation, he was describing depth. Scholars who study mystical Christianity often note that this teaching survived only in fragments, scattered across texts, sayings, and practices. Yet, its core remains consistent. Unity recognized, perception purified, origin remembered. The three designations of the monad were never separate steps in time. They were dimensions of realization, unfolding as readiness allowed. Now understand this clearly. Speaking a name tonight, as suggested by the title of this exploration, was never about pronunciation. It was about alignment. To speak the first is to rest in unity. To speak the second is to see without distortion. To speak the third is to remain as presence itself. When these converge, the gate opens not outward but inward, and what opens is not something new but what has always been. This is why these teachings were transmitted quietly, patiently, and rarely. They do not seek followers. They recognize readiness. If something within you feels stirred, unsettled, or strangely familiar, that is not coincidence. Early mystics would say that recognition is remembering, not learning. As this journey concludes, do not rush to conclusions. Let silence do its work. Let questions remain open. The most powerful transformation does not announce itself loudly. It integrates gently, reshaping perception from within. The gate is not guarded by force. It opens through truth. And truth, as Jesus taught, is not something you possess. It is something you become. Thanks for looking.